We were just talking how cold it is throughout the entire US. Chicago, I'm imagining, is pretty cold.
There. Oh my gosh. Yeah, Minnesota also really painfully cold right now. And I
Um,
think even when you live in a place that gets that cold, this is still cold. Yeah.
yeah, it's fun at Collegewise. We have a lot of colleagues who live all over the US, and no one has worn warmer clothes to calls today than those in Southern California. It's 35 degrees for them, but relatively it's so cold. So people are coming in parkas, wearing hats. It's very comical. For those who are watching the recording in the future, I hope it has gotten warmer by that point. The first thing I'm going to do before we get started is actually learn a little bit about you today. So I'm launching a poll right now. We're very curious if you are a parent, guardian, student, an educator. For the grade of your student, we'd love to hear where they are so we can tailor some of the conversation. And then some of the reasons that you came to the webinar today. We know all of you are doing research. So we provide a lot of great advice. In fact, we have a lot of webinars here at Collegewise, and I'm going to drop a link right now to our more general webinars. I will say this is a bit more of a niche topic for us, focusing on AI. We have some more general ones. And there's also one I'd really love to highlight that's happening tomorrow. So Meredith and I are both on our thought leadership team. And part of the reason you're hearing from two people of our thought leadership team is because it is the team that's very focused on how education is changing with things like AI. And then our colleague, Christopher, another member of the team, also has been doing a lot of research, and specifically, they just published a white paper around early action and early decision. They're doing a webinar on that topic tomorrow. So you can sign up for that webinar. Thank you everyone for filling out the poll so far. That's all very helpful. And then for normal Zoom, I know that we are 4 years from the pandemic starting, so most of you are probably familiar, but you can go ahead and add any questions in the Q&A box. That's very helpful if you put it in Q&A versus just the chat, because that way people can upvote, and we can also type responses to questions we don't get to. So feel free to throw that in. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to first introduce who Collegewise is, and then we will talk a little bit about who we are. And today's structure is really going to be a Q&A, more of a conversation between Meredith and I. And we're going to focus first on higher ed and how they are using AI right now, particularly as it comes to admissions. We are going to talk a bit about how admissions offices work, because that does help put how AI can be used into context. The second part of what we'll discuss is really how students can use AI right now, what is and isn't allowed, and the trends we're seeing there, even with things like summer programs. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of our predictions of how we think AI is going to impact admissions and education more broadly. Okay, who is Collegewise? So we were the very first nationwide counseling firm within the US focused on college admissions. So we started back in 1999. So we are going into our 25th year, which is pretty incredible. And our mission is truly to be the most trusted source of information when it comes to all things admissions. So like I mentioned, we put on a lot of webinars. We have a lot of ebooks and guides as well. And then we do a lot of one-on-one services for families who are looking to get direct support with an expert. So for middle school students, we have what's called success skills. And so we have specific tutors or experts who guide those students in learning executive functioning skills like project management, effective communication, time management. But most of who we help are actually high school students. And so when high school students join us in their younger years, when they're underclassmen, we help really think through what they can be doing throughout high school. So questions around what courses to take, how to build rigor in that course load, how to make decisions over what to do over a summer, what kind of experiences a student should be looking for. We're really helping them shape their profile. And then where we add a lot of support is in the admissions process. So as students are going through figuring out the right school for them, how to portray themselves, how to fill out all the spots on the Common App, that's where we really jump in and give a lot of guidance from our experiences. And one very incredible thing about Collegewise is that we have a lot of former admissions officers who are able to add a lot of perspective on what schools are looking for. So Collegewise works with many families. We also work with school districts and nonprofits as well. So that's a little bit about us. And then about me, I'm based in Montclair, New Jersey. So we just got a little bit of snow here. And my background has very heavily been within education. So I'm very deeply passionate about how high schoolers can better figure out their path, what their passions are and how they can make an impact there. And so much of that is around reflecting on their skill set and how they can grow that. And that really came from my own experiences back in the early 2000s in high school, seeing that a lot of students were just doing activities for the sake of building their college profile versus trying to make a meaningful impact. And then I've worked in education in many different capacities, including with the US Department of Education, with higher ed institutes. And I've been within the admission space for about the last 7 years. And the last 2 of those, I've been at Collegewise as the CEO. And so it's been very incredible seeing Collegewise's impact and getting to work with wonderful people like Meredith. So I will pass it to Meredith to introduce herself.
Thanks, Ashley. My name is Meredith Graham. You probably figured that one out by now from the bio that's on the screen, or the name tag that's on the screen and everything like that. I am in my 11th year here at Collegewise. I started in July of 2013. Part of what brought me here, I spent about 15 years before that on the college side, doing a combination of admissions and advising and college-specific recruiting. And I worked at 4 different universities, Kent State University, I worked at Purdue University, spent 7 years as Associate Director of Admissions at Cornell University. And then I spent about a year in a retention office at Boston University, which is sort of a very interesting experience. And one of the reasons that I became an independent counselor and joined Collegewise was because of those experiences on the college side. This is such a pivotal transition for students in high school, choosing to go to college, because college isn't necessarily right for all students. It is fantastic to have it as an option. I do think most students should attend college at some point, but students have to, have a certain amount of readiness, and they have to have the self-awareness in order to choose colleges that are going to be a great fit for them. And one of the hard parts sometimes about being on the college side was seeing students who maybe had made choices that weren't totally in their self-interest in choosing the college that they were at, either had chosen, for, reasons that didn't necessarily support them. And so I love, so choosing a college, for example, that didn't offer the major that they knew that they wanted. Well, that's sort of unfortunate if you choose a college, if you want this major and you choose a college that doesn't offer that major. There's a mismatch there. That's never going to work out. So, working with students here at Collegewise, I get to be an advocate for students and families to go through this process in a way that's smart, and to help eliminate as much stress as possible. I mean, it can't be completely stress-free. I wish it could be, but it can't be completely stress-free. But to help reduce and eliminate and answer questions as honestly and sanely and compassionately as I can, and know that I'm doing it with the student at the center. I'm not having to advocate for any particular college along the way, which is really nice to sort of have that freedom and flexibility. So that's part of why I've been here now for my 11th year. So because I get a chance to do those things, and I get a chance to have cool conversations like this one, which you don't get to do quite as often on the college side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you hit on one of our values at Collegewise of bringing joy into the process rather than fear. There's so much misinformation out there. And I think with the advent of AI, there's going to be even more. And there's so many nuances to admissions too. So I think that's part of where we're really hoping to keep an eye on how things are going and continue to do webinars like this one. So Meredith, let's start at the beginning. We talked about first discussing how higher ed is using AI. What has been happening? How does higher ed approach new technology, and where are you seeing AI being adopted?
Yeah, so AI, I mean, it's sort of the bright, shiny new toy, right? It has such incredible power, such incredible potential. But then we have higher ed institutions that are cautious in adopting new policies and adopting new ways of doing things. And so, which of course is a nice way of saying they're slow to adopt sometimes. And there's some that are more nimble and more willing to, sign on for new tools than others. But for the most part, this is something where it tends to be a slow, deliberative process before there will be any major shifts within different higher ed organizations, within different universities. Um, the biggest way right now, within the admission sphere that we're aware of it, is there are some colleges already that are using AI to scan transcripts, like to scan them, to screen them, to sort of collate and integrate them. Um, and one of the reasons that can be helpful, back when I was on the college side reading applications, the first question you're asking yourself anytime you're reading an application is this student academically prepared for this campus? Do they have the coursework? Do they have the grades? Do they have the rigor to support them? Because if you say yes to a student, you want them to be positioned to succeed on your campus. And in order to do that, you have to be able to review the student transcript and understand what classes they've already taken and how well they've performed in those classes. Well, I can tell you, schools, districts, states do super squirrely things with transcripts. There is no uniform transcript. There's certain, kinds of styles. There's some software that generates them that typically looks like this, but then there are districts that have policies where they look like that. So having an AI tool that can go in and sort of pull together and collate into one common sort of an application style, or one sort of a form, so that I as a reader can go in and read more quickly, to be able to sort of see, does the student have the academics, but then really be able to spend the time on sort of the holistic piece of it, which is, moving beyond just the grades and the transcript, and really considering all of the different elements that the student could bring to the campus. So their own writing, their essays, letters of recommendation, and really getting to know the student a little bit more. So it's a way that, can trim maybe just a tiny bit of time off to be able to allow the colleges to do that a bit more effectively.
Yeah, and I'll add there some background for those who don't know how admissions offices are often structured. The larger schools, like the UCs, who get the most applications of any school in the US, they actually hire seasonal workers who are readers who do a lot of that transcript focus before it even gets to the admissions committee. So that's where the admissions officer actually sits, and they read closely, they advocate for students. So a lot of what we're seeing where AI being used is not replacing the admissions officer. It may be some of the people in advance. Now, there's certainly smaller schools, very tiny liberal arts colleges often do not have the need for a reader. So it depends on the school, but that is where I think higher ed, as you mentioned, Meredith, it's cautious, and they realize it's students' lives that they're considering. So I think they're playing it pretty safe, and transcript review seems like a easy, clear-cut one. So do you think that's going to change?
Yes, I do. There's been some colleges that are sort of playing around with other possible ways to use AI within their offices. For example, there was a piece in Inside Higher Ed a couple months ago, that an Inside Higher Ed is kind of like one of the industry, like one of the trade papers, if you will. Um, and there was a piece in there about a team of researchers from UC Boulder and then from the University of Pennsylvania that had created some AI tools to help admissions officers by doing some essay analysis. So like trying to go through and sort of kind of like with like the optical readers or what have you that you have a lot of times in big companies with resumes now, we're sort of going through and picking out keywords. And There's some potential advantages for that, and there's some potential disadvantages to that. What they found when they did that research was of it was like 300,000 applications that had been submitted during this window of time, and they were looking at applications from like 5, 10 years ago, so like 2008 to 2009, I think it was. And each of them included a 150-word essay. And so they used those applications and those essays to try to train the platform and search for like certain traits that they were looking for in students. So leadership, for example, would have been one of them. But trying to sort of go beyond just looking at the word leadership and trying to sort of figure out like what is the substance that is behind what makes the trait of leadership. Um, and it has some potential. They said, oh, there were some interesting, sort of takeaways. It was able to sort of pull in and glean some things, but there definitely were some problems with it. For example, it was, identifying certain keywords mistakenly, I guess. One of the examples they gave where it was a failure was a student could say that they donated heroin to a shelter, for example, and it would still sort of frame that as being a positive thing because the student was donating something to a shelter, not sort of paying attention to what the word is of what they donated. So I think we're a ways away yet from admissions offices being able to actually use those in any meaningful way. But I do think that we'll start to see them using a bit more quickly to sort of pull in keywords from letters of recommendation. I do think that we will start to see that before we will see it with reviewing student applications or the student essays themselves.
I love that anecdote you shared because it's quite funny. AI can figure out so much, but they don't necessarily have the association of something like heroin being negative.
Right.
There's certainly comical things can come up. But I definitely want to underscore the fact that Penn teamed up with Boulder to do this study means that there's a lot of curiosity. And I think when studies do show reliability with I think there's just going to be a mass switch where universities tend to sort of bandwagon after a few people experiment and try things. When we asked you what grade years all of you who are joining us or your teen are joining us from, it looks like there's a couple of you who are 10th and 11th. And I think for the 10th graders, you're much more likely to see some more of that adoption. Totally agreed on the letters of recommendation being a quick place that they're going to try and pull some insights. I'm sure a lot of you on this call use Amazon, and that has been one of the biggest trials of if you can pull quick highlights from things like reviews to make it easier for people. Now, it's not to say that people blindly trust the AI synopsis, but it gives them some focus and direction that they can target on a couple of things. So I think that's pretty fascinating. So the short for kind of this section, how higher ed is using AI right now in admissions, is that it's in very small and particular areas, but they are some of the more innovative universities are doing some research, and they're trying to figure out where it does and doesn't work right now. So let's switch over to students and AI. What are you seeing that schools are saying is allowed and what is not allowed?
Yeah, I think I think, one of the places where we will see the greatest transformation between today and next fall next summer, when the applications start to open for the students who are juniors this year, 11th graders. Um, when this all sort of came down the pike this year, most colleges didn't have any sort of policies around this. I think Georgia Tech was the first out the gate with an actual policy around how AI could and could not be, or should and should not be, used by students in their applications. And then I think Caltech followed suit pretty quickly after that. And then there have been other colleges that have followed suit as well. And NACAC, which is the National Association that sort of the umbrella for school counselors, college counselors, and college admissions officers, they've sort of put out a statement about, what they would sort of say are suggested best practices, but there's no real like policy around it yet, at like overarching at this point. But that is starting to change. I was working with a student on a summer program application about Oh, well, last week I think it was. And it's a summer program application that's based at a particular university. And that university in this summer program application specifically said, ChatGPT, it can be useful, other generative AI, they can be really useful, and we understand that you might want to use them. Here's how you can use them. And so they talked about generating ideas and sparking interest and sort of helping them organize their thoughts a little bit. But we expect you to use your own words. We expect you not to copy and paste any phrases or sentences. And then they also specifically said, if you are using any form of AI, we expect you to tell us that you are in this essay and to tell us how you used it. And I actually think that that's a really smart policy for that college. I expect that college will make that part of their application policy next year. I'll be watching for it. And I think that's the kind of thing we can start to expect from colleges, is to sort of specifically say, here's how this works, here's how this doesn't. There were a couple of colleges even that between sort of the early decision applications in October and November, early November, and then the regular decision deadlines in January, that they sort of added in a quick little paragraph where a student had to, on the Common App, where a student had to sort of click and say, yes, I promise that I didn't use generative AI to sort of copy and paste an essay. And like, this really is all my own stuff. Like if I used, rephrase stuff. So I think I think those trends are going to start to continue from colleges.
Yeah, it really felt like ChatGPT almost came out of nowhere. And then, of course, Bard and we've got Anthropic, and so many companies sprung, but the hype around it was so sudden that most colleges, I think, were scrambling to come up with any policy of what students can do. So a lot of colleges are on the Common App. And for those who are less familiar, it's the main portal through which students can apply to universities. Now, there are some universities that are not on the Common App, but especially during the pandemic, we saw that the vast majority of holdouts did join. So the Common App has a box that basically makes you attest to not cheating on the Common App itself. And so a lot of universities just pointed at that and they're like, oh, well, the Common App says that, so I think we're okay. And as Meredith pointed out, like some universities came out and said, hey, actually, like there are things in AI that are okay. And I think the funny thing is that it mostly was computer science programs. So Georgia Tech, Stanford, they really led the way in tech policies that were friendly to a student using AI in very specific circumstances, but not for actually writing their essay. So I certainly do think now that schools see these leaders doing that they're going to come up with their own tech policies. And it's certainly been shifting from the no AI to, yeah, we want you to have some familiarity with this tool. So we think that that's really the direction that it's going in overall.
There was even a rumor earlier this year, and I remember the school that the rumor was about, and I went to the school's website and searched the school's website, could find no evidence of this being fact rather than rumor, so I won't name this school. But there was a rumor that there was a school that said, okay, you have to write an essay for our application this year. You can either write it on this topic or you can write it on that topic, or you can use ChatGPT or another sort of generative AI to write an essay on this third topic, and then you paste that essay and then you critique how that essay was put together by the AI. So again, no evidence that that school actually did that. But that's actually kind of an um, interesting kind of a thought, that there's a college that might do that. And I actually do think that there's some merit to that as well, and understanding, how is this writing coming together through the AI, and how can it be improved? How can students learn to be better writers themselves from, what AI, the product of AI, and how it is and is not being generated.
So I think that that's pretty fun. And I actually want to share an article that came out in the Washington Post last week, where they actually have you as a reader go in and see if you can figure out if a college essay was AI or not. It's a fun game. I enjoyed playing it. So I'll pop the link in the chat box. But as I'm looking that up and posting it, Meredith, of course, there are going to be instances where students do use AI. So can you talk a little bit about when you were in admissions, if there was suspected plagiarism, how that's usually handled?
Yeah. So, and it can be, again, you are mindful when you are in admissions. You're mindful that these are young people, that you are, making decisions about someone's future. And so this is a place where I think some caution is warranted. You don't want to jump to conclusions that a student, perhaps use someone else's writing for their application. But sometimes it is so very obvious that it is not something that the student wrote that you can't, you have to take some action. So, there was one year that I was at Cornell, and we caught, every year we caught at least one student who had plagiarized an essay. But there was one year in particular, and it was one of the students in my region where I, read the application. And it was just strange because the first line of the essay was, "It's tough being a techie at Burlington Township High School." Now, that would have been perfectly fine, except the student had never attended a high school called Burlington Township High School. So immediately I thought, wait, something's not right here. And so I, read through the essay and the rest of the application. And there were just a couple of little things at that point where I was like, something's a little off. And so I talked with my director at that point and we agreed we needed to talk to the school. So we called the school counselor and we're sitting in my director's office with the speakerphone, and we called the director and the director of school counseling at the school, and she said, "Oh, so and so, great student, really really like him." And we're like, "Well, so here's the thing, here's the first line of this student's essay." And she said, "Oh, I'm sure there's some explanation." We're like, "Yeah, that's why we're calling. We'd love to sort of understand how and why this happened." um really trying to give the student a chance to give us some kind of a plausible explanation other than "this isn't my own work." And, she went and got the student out of class and he came in and she started asking him questions and he was hemming and hawing and stammering and couldn't give us any coherent, plausible explanation. And so it was pretty clear at that point that he knew he'd been caught giving us something that wasn't his. And the director even said, we could hear her tone shifting. And she finally just sort of said, I think you have all of the information you need. Yes. And we said, "Yes, we do. Thank you." And she said, "Okay, thanks." So clearly we said no to that student. We didn't want to say yes to a student who had submitted something that was clearly fraudulent as part of their application. And there was one case, a different case where it was somebody who submitted a fraudulent essay where we actually, sent an extra special letter to the student because there were fraudulent letters of recommendation as well, which was also extra fun. And we actually specifically told the student that he was never allowed to apply again. So it wasn't even just that he wasn't admitted as an undergrad, but he was never allowed to apply to the university in any capacity again, undergrad through grad school ever. That one was a pretty spectacularly rough case. And nobody, believe me, we didn't take any joy in doing this either. I want to make sure you know that. But it is, yeah, yeah. So yeah, not fun.
No, not at all. And I think, you shed some light on the humanity behind admissions. I think it's so often when students and families get caught up in how intense admissions is, you forget that it's actually people who are sitting and thinking through this. Um, so Meredith, those were more blatant examples of plagiarism.
Yeah.
How would you handle it if it was sort of on the fence? You weren't sure if someone used something or not.
Yeah. And so for students, especially at a place like Cornell, where, we had these many applications and these many seats, um, if it was something where we thought this is a little bit suspicious, we're just not really sure what the situation is. A lot of times that gave us a reason to say no. And so for a student where we weren't sure everything was on the up and up in their application, it was much easier for us to say no. Because we didn't always have the time to chase down every moment because you have a lot of applications you're reading, a huge volume of applications. When I was, my last 2 or 3 years I was at Cornell, I was first reading 100 applications a week and second reading 250 applications a week, which is a massive number of applications. And that was before we even got to committee, where we were discussing them as a group, our entire staff. That is it's and so trying to make the time to call and follow up on every single moment of, wait, something's not right there. We just didn't have that bandwidth, unfortunately. I wish we did, but we didn't. And so for a student where we're like, I don't, I'm not so sure about that. A lot of times it was easier to just let them go, let them go. They'll find a home, and move on from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with these schools that are so selective, the numbers of applications are so high. I would say it's absolutely not worth the risk. Here at Collegewise, we have a full essay editing team. So for families that work with us for programs, all their essays actually go through that set of professional essay editors, and so they process 20 to 30,000 essays in any application season. So we're able to pick up on essay trends very quickly. To give you an example, this year we saw a lot of essays about Taylor Swift and Ted Lasso and ice baths of all things. So that's something where we're able to kind of catch the trends and then help a student drill down a little deeper. And this year we did see a lot of essays that felt as though the student may have used AI. And so when we went back to the student, it wasn't necessarily saying, hey, this looks off. It was, hey, this essay doesn't feel authentic to you. You need to add more personality. And I think that's a big takeaway for anyone here. It's not just whether or not you can use AI, it's, are you writing a really good essay? And can AI actually make you a spectacular essay? No, because they don't really know you and your personality. So that's one big thing. I think a great essay requires a lot of that time, and a lot of that reflection on who you are. And the other thing I'll add here is that almost every single university already invests in plagiarism tools. So pretty much everyone uses Turnitin, which is one word. It's this very large company. And they, for decades, have had tools for professors to put in essays that are submitted to them, and so it's very easy for admissions to use this as well. Now, Turnitin has been very much focused on AI and how to detect it. And I would say a year ago, they were saying, hey, we're about 90% sure we can pick up on things. But admissions is something where you're getting a high volume of things very quickly. So it's only going to get better. And, I'd venture to guess that more and more universities are going to say, okay, hey, we already have this tool. We might as well use it for admissions. So that's all the more reason not to use AI. For actually writing the essay, at least. Certainly it can be a starting place. It can be a way for you to get an idea of structure or ideas or things like that. But then really sitting down and doing it yourself as a student is very important.
And I suspect too that when you are reading high volumes of applications, um, as Anjali said, you notice those trends. And so I suspect that, at the start of the year this year, admissions officers may not have passed the quiz that Anjali put in the from the Washington Post that's in the chat. There's a chance that they might not have passed that quiz. And there was some, drama about a year ago, sort of in February, March about, oh, even admissions officers can't tell the difference, which, I'm sure was true at the time. But when you read a high volume of the essays, you start to see patterns. You start to recognize, just like with our editing team, you start to tell. And so I'll be really surprised if admissions officers can't pick out AI generated essays pretty reliably by the end of this application cycle. I would imagine that most of them would get it right most of the time. Not perfectly, not universally. And so having something like a Turnitin as an option will be nice as well. But it's pretty easy when you're reading applications. You can usually tell when an adult has written an essay on behalf of a student. And so I suspect that sort of spidey sense in admissions readers is probably going to be refined over the course of the year this year, which will also help.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, I'd love for you to say, as a current counselor, how do you help students write a really good essay that doesn't sound like a parent and does help them be authentic?
So a lot of it goes back to some of what you were saying about, this doesn't sound like you. So, when we're doing our essay brainstorming process, we have students do some pre-writing where they're sort of jotting down notes and sort of thoughts and ideas about questions. And my favorites that we use, we have a couple of different, pieces that we ask students to do, but one of them is basically some fill in the blanks. And one of them is, the thing that surprises people the most about me is fill in the blank. And there's some really funny kinds of things. I had a student last year where her response was, I hate condiments. And I was like, wait, what? You hate condiments? And she's like, yeah, I can't stand ketchup. I think it shouldn't be a thing. So we had this whole really funny conversation about condiments, and she doesn't like mustard either. Well, that led into a conversation, which led into a conversation, which ended up leading into this really hilarious and very authentically her personal statements around some of her other little personal quirks, where people were like, we love you, but like, these are strange things, but we love you anyway, despite these, or perhaps because of them. And her essay was hilarious and delightful and so very her. So we have some sort of fundamental principles that we're trying to use when we're having students write these essays. And one of them is to have students own their story. That's a long time term that we've used, and it's where students add so much detail, personal detail, that the story that they're telling could only be theirs. So that's one of the keys, and AI definitely can't do that. And one of the other ones is your essay should sound like you. A student's essay really, if they were to drop it in the hallway of their school, print it out at the printing lab, or, this doesn't happen as much anymore at schools, but, because most of it's electronic. But if you were to have it on paper and drop it in the hallway in the school, even if there were no name on it, somebody should, in theory, if your best friend were to pick it up, they should be able to look at it and be like, hey, I'm pretty sure this was yours. They should be able to see it and know that you were the one telling that story. And so those are, when we're working with students, those are the kinds of details we're trying to help draw out of them and have them include in the essay. And when I get a draft from a student where I'm like, this doesn't sound like you, I actually will, highlight sections of it and send it back to them and say, in terms of editing, like, this doesn't sound like the you that I've gotten to know. Is there another way you can say this? Or, sometimes I'll highlight a word and say, would you actually use this word in conversation? If the answer is no, it doesn't belong in the essay. And so, so we have some of those different sort of tools that we use. And even our editing team, the editing that they do is a little different than other kinds of editing, because they're actually trained to help students bring out their best without interfering with the student voice, it's a very delicate balance.
Oh, it is. And even for the parents on the call, you will have those moments where you read a sentence and you think, I could rewrite this. It will take me 1 minute. It would be so much easier. And that is, I think, counseling and essay editing. We want to rewrite things, but you have to let the student put it in their voice to really give them that chance of getting there. Yeah, Meredith, I love the short questions, because it can feel so daunting to read the Common App prompts or a lot of these school prompts. But just starting with that rolling of like, who are you, is a really nice transition into everything. Yeah, I will also shift to acknowledge a little bit of the benefits of AI in kind of, a student and how they might be screened. There is a lot of human bias in admissions. Admissions officers have a lot of reading, they get tired. So hopefully, as AI does shift to be able to support admissions, it can even call out, help the admissions officer look at that student's voice and some of the highlights, so that they can directly zero in on some of the best parts of the student too. And it can be kind of that second voice in things. In some ways, like maybe you do need to give this another glance. Maybe you didn't spend enough time here. So there are certainly benefits that may pop up over time with AI. I see a question here from Olivia. Is it possible for a student to compose a personal essay first and have AI check it for grammar? Absolutely. I would say this is essentially spell check. Grammarly is a great tool. You just don't want to use tools that rewrite what you have written. So for example, if you put in an essay in ChatGPT and say, make this sound better, it will rewrite sentences. It will move things around. But if you use something like Grammarly, it is literally just checking for grammar, and that is fine to use.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will also say that at least for now, it's also probably helpful to have a human look at it as well, because if you like with, and the only reason I say this, with spell check, if you accept all changes in spell check, you can end up with some pretty pretty funny. When we do an essay seminar as well, and when I give this live, there's a district here locally. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, by the way. I realized I didn't say that when I was introducing myself. There's a district here where I give the presentation, and I tell a story about an essay. This was not an essay that I got when I was at Cornell, but we were on one of the 5 colleges traveling together kinds of trips, where it was a representative from Rice University who shared this story about a student had talked about how much she loved volunteering at the hospital, and how wonderful it was, and how much she loved, because she'd been a volunteer for years, and she just loved seeing the smile on Mr. Smith's face when she walked into his room every week, and blah 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 blah, all of those things. And the essay was about her being a candy striper. However, she did not have a human look at her essay after she accepted all changes, and she wrote the entire essay about being a candy stripper.
Oh, that's brutal.
Right. And the rep, to her credit, the rep from Rice who was telling us this story said that she laughed until she cried, because when she read it, she said it was unintentionally hilarious. Um, and spell check's not going to catch that. I don't, hopefully AI will, but that's not 100% sure. And so she said it was really unintentionally hilarious. And when she got to the end of it, she made herself, sort of step away, calm down, and then read it as she knew the student had intended. And they did ultimately end up admitting that student. But that story, that was almost 20 years ago. And that could just as easily happen today if you're not careful. So just make sure, use the spell check, it's okay to use it for some grammar, but maybe just have a human look at it too as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness. As a Grammarly user myself, I certainly catch things that I'm like, oh, that is not correct
yeah,
Grammarly.
exactly. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
let's switch over to our final section. What are some of your predictions of how AI is going to change admissions or education more broadly?
Yeah. I think that as people are getting used to it and understanding it better, I think that is going to become more, I don't want to say commonplace, but I think some of the fear around it, especially sort of the initial like kinds of panicky kinds of things, are going to go away. Early last year, actually just about a year ago, ChatGPT was completely banned from all devices in New York City public schools. And then, a few months later in May, they were like, actually, we guess it's okay, and sort of reversed course. And then in October, they decided that they were going to launch an AI policy lab to guide the nation's largest district with the technology. So I think we're going to see more of those kinds of things, of places really embracing it and trying to figure out how they can use it for the greater good of their students, of their teachers, of their educators, their professors, their staff. Um, I think in particular, one of the places that we'll see it in the admissions process a year from now, I actually think teachers and school counselors are going to start using it to help them write letters of recommendation. There's already a lot of talk around this as a possibility. And there also have been some shifts around letters of recommendation to more of like a bullet point style as opposed to full on narrative. And, AI sort of lends itself to more of that style anyway. And so if that's something that a school counselor could do to save themselves some time and help more of their kids get to college and get to great fit colleges for them, that I think would be a huge bonus for them. You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. School counselors definitely have so many letters of recommendation. And I'll add some context there that not only does a school counselor have to write a letter per student, but they're also in charge of what's called a school profile. So basically, they send a double-sided one pager that talks about the school and everything that's included. So admissions officers get a lot of context of the student relative to their school from that one pager that doesn't need to go into the letter of recommendation every time. And that is, again, to help the school counselor. So I certainly think we're going to see more of that, where it can just be the highlights specific to that student that can be written quickly. Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. I also think that the other big thing that I think we're going to see, and we sort of mentioned before, is within a year, I think we're going to see most, if not all, colleges having some sort of a specific statement about how can AI be used in approaching their particular application. And I suspect that it's going to be fairly consistent across colleges. I don't think you're going to have some places say, well, it's okay if you can use it to write these 4 things, but not this, and other places saying don't use it at all. I think we're going to see a fair amount of consistency, which makes it easier for students, that you don't have to factor in completely different AI policies, in addition to all of the other pieces that you're trying to sort of hold in your mind as well. But I do expect that many of them will clarify that, yeah, getting some proofreading, some grammar, some spell check from AI is perfectly acceptable, to sort of go back to the previous question too.
Yeah. One of the tricky things with AI is that it's always getting better too. So, I mean, right now we feel as though we can detect AI, but it might be something that in the future you train AI to write more essays in that super personal style. So I do, yeah, I'll also add there that I think there's going to be more and more updates and changes to tools like Turnitin, and schools are going to rely on that. The more it feels like, hey, this is a sure bet that the student used AI here. There have been all sorts of talks about watermarks and things like that, that only AI can code into the language that you can't remove. So that'll be really interesting to see how and when they can figure that out. But again, just not worth it for a student to risk it. So let's shift a little bit to a couple of years out, or even some of the broader changes that we might expect in the actual admissions components. So I'll start with testing. So the last few years, testing has sort of been all over the place. Even before the pandemic, schools were starting to think, hey, should I really put weight on the SAT and ACT? And this was also back when we had things like SAT 2s. And so it was a really big shift within admissions. I think it was about 6 years ago now, or 5 years ago, that
Yeah.
College Board decided no longer to have SAT 2s. And so those were specific tests off of subjects, but they were very similar to the AP exams. They were just offered more times of the year. So with the SAT 2s going away, people were saying, hey, what is there going to be a heavier reliance on the SAT, ACT, and APs? Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and a lot of students were unable to take the tests. And so every school, for the most part, had to go test optional. And so schools have been really closely studying what is happening with that. And then about 2 years ago, we had a very big shift of MIT, who came forward and said, we tried the test optional thing and we realized that these standardized tests, the SAT, ACT, are actually very helpful for us in predicting how well a student will do when they get to campus. Makes sense for an engineering program, or mostly engineering, that they really needed that kind of testing. So we've now seen schools shift back. And there have been a couple of articles that came out this month that have focused on the fact that the SAT, ACT does help predict better outcomes. So again, this is a place where everyone predicted it would go away. It hasn't really. Now, where AI falls in this is that there might be a world in which schools rely less on essays, and they do want to use testing more, to kind of figure out some of those components of what essays kind of gave them in terms of, how a student might do at that school. That said, it doesn't really allow for the personality. So Meredith, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things we're seeing with interviews right now?
Yeah. So I will, and this is one of the places where Christopher, our other colleague on the thought leadership team, we actually had an exchange earlier today around this exact topic, around the standardized testing. I'm actually not as convinced that it's going to come back. I think that there's a lot more, it's a way more complicated. There's a lot more context. And at the same time that MIT brought back their test because it's predictive for them. So yay, I'm glad for them that it is. Caltech is in the middle of a 5-year score-free pilot where they said, we don't think it actually predicts anything on our campus, at least not in any meaningful way. And so they're using data on their own campus to sort of assess whether or not it's meaningful on their campus. And I think it's fascinating that arguably the two most famous engineering colleges in the US are taking diametrically opposed stances on this. And Caltech, to their credit, they're saying, we're doing this pilot, we're doing this as a study. And at the end of it, then we'll decide what to do based on the data that we find during this era. And the early data that they shared at the national conference last year suggested that they were doing just fine without the standardized tests, and it wasn't actually predictive for them. So I'll be very curious to see if that proves out. And then we would be in a world where MIT is saying, this is super predictive for us, and Caltech theoretically could be saying, this is not at all predictive for us. So what exactly does that mean, and how much more confusing is that for students as well? So I just, I'm sort of joking that I'm sitting here with the popcorn, sort of watching all of this. In terms of interviews, though, I do think that I think we all sort of agree within our thought leadership that that interviews are likely to come back. But the prediction that we're sort of making is it's going to be more sort of the video introduction, the video interviews, and less the interpersonal ones, particularly for the larger volume application schools. There are a couple of schools like the University of Chicago and Brown, for example, over the last couple of years have stopped offering alumni interviews and started offering students the chance to upload a video that's like 2 minutes to their website after they have submitted their application. So it goes straight into and sort of is connected to their application, and sort of saying, share something about yourself that isn't elsewhere in your application or that you want to emphasize. There are also some, Duke started offering something this year called Glimpse, which is actually offered by an external company called Initial View. And that company actually has sort of created like a standardized, almost a timed interview kind of a situation, which sounds stressful, but apparently can be really beneficial for students as well. And again, that's, it's another way to sort of share a little bit about who you are with the college. So I think we're going to continue to see more of those kinds of things for sure.
Yeah, I have to say timed video interviews are daunting, even for, I feel like, us adults.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
this is not something necessarily new that's come around because of AI. Colleges have been testing this for the last 5, 6 years, particularly for international students to test their English competency, because there was so much cheating going on with the TOEFL and so on. And then MBA programs in particular have been using video interviews for quite some time, since about 2015 or 2013, actually. So we're going on 10 years of schools having proof of how video interviews work. But schools have always been very cautious on anything that adds more pressure to students. So I think this is where AI is really pushing them along to adopt for a broader audience. And that's why you'll see a lot of optional in the coming years. But then I do expect it to become more commonplace. So a lot of you are probably wondering, if you're a student, what you should be doing to prepare for these kinds of changes, or if you're a parent, how you can help your student. And I would say really going back to that, soft skills of being able to effectively communicate, feeling very comfortable speaking to an adult, feeling comfortable on camera. Those are all things that'll be beneficial. Whether or not AI impacts this aspect of admissions, you likely can expect it for things like job screenings or eventually graduate school applications. So I would say the more you can practice that sort of thing right now, the better. So we'll even recommend for our students to just go out and speak to some adults on a topic that you find interesting and start to get in the habit of practicing. And like I mentioned earlier, we do have a whole division that's focused on these skills, what we call success skills too. What do you expect down the line? So let's say like 5 to 10 years from now, what you think AI might change?
Yeah, so I do think that down the line, I think one of the sort of phenomena that's going on right now is that the more selective, more competitive colleges are getting skyrocketing application volumes still, um, overall, and everyone else sort of is having either flat application volume or decreasing application volume, and I think that's going to continue. So for places where the application volume is dropping, particularly for public schools that aren't quite as competitive or aren't as selective, so in this part of the world, we often refer to them as sort of the regional public universities. I did my master's at Kent State University, and back when I was a grad student, I worked in admissions, and we used to have essentially a cookbook. So a student had to have a certain ACT score, a certain number of college prep units. So, 4 units of English, 3 units of social studies, 3 of math, etc. And then they had a certain minimum unweighted GPA. And as long as they had those, they were admitted. I think that that is going to become more common again with the less selective publics. I think we're going to see that increasingly. I think it's going to be less holistic admission. And those colleges, I don't think they'll be requiring standardized tests again, but I do think that they'll be figuring out how to sort of adapt a cookbook, like a checklist admissions to a test optional world. And then for students who have tests and want to take them and want to share them, it would make it a little bit more easy. Um, and I also do think somebody had asked a question in the Q&A about whether or not we thought that, colleges would ultimately, sort of accept AI generated essays and sort of endorse them. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that colleges are going to start to assume that students are using AI, even if they're not asking students to confirm that they are. I think that, within about 5 years, I think colleges are going to sort of say, yeah, we're pretty sure that most or all of our applicants are using it. And they're also going to have very sort of specific policies around what works, like what is permitted and what isn't permitted. But I don't ever see a world where allowing an AI generation to write your essay for you would be considered acceptable or encouraged. I don't see that, in part because, when you get to college, you have to write papers. Like, being able to write is a part of the skill set you need to develop and sort of, continue to cultivate, and use to thrive and survive in college. And yeah, you'll be able to use AI in classes, although I think, anti-plagiarism policies in classes are going to be, I think those are going to be just as refined by that time, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I would say it's very akin to the TI-89 calculator or
Yes. Yes.
using Excel or sheets in a class,
Mhm.
where some classrooms certainly adopt it and even encourage it. Or, with tests, they might allow you to have a one-page cheat sheet that's encouraged for the exam. But those are still one-off instances. Like, I'd say maybe 20% of classes might have something like that. But academia tends to be pretty old school in a lot of ways, which is probably where the term came from. So yeah, I think it's going to be a hard battle. And I agree with Meredith. I think more schools are just going to get rid of essays, period, and just go to more straightforward admissions if they're less selective schools. But the hyper competitive schools, I think, will always have some element of really getting to know the student, because such their priority is building that dream class of theirs with a lot of diversity. And I mean that in a lot of ways. They just want students who have different interests and backgrounds who can contribute. So I would say it's going to be an interesting time. And I will say, having been in admissions the last 7 years and for Meredith 11 years, it always is changing. The SCOTUS, the Supreme Court decision earlier this year, changed a lot. The pandemic changed so much. So it's definitely a shifting landscape. So it's fantastic that all of you here are actively doing research and thinking about it. And certainly with Collegewise, we will make sure to keep you posted in all of the trends here. We're about time on our webinar, but I saw that a couple of you were interested in learning more about Collegewise. So I would say, if you're looking at kind of free information, definitely signing up for some of the seminars. If you want to get a sense of our programs, pricing, all of that, we do adapt to all different budgets, and we set you up with an expert to give a lot of this guidance. So I've included a link here where you can actually book a really short 15-minute call just to see if it's a good match between you and Collegewise. And then, of course, if you sign up for any of our webinars or our newsletter on our homepage, then you're going to continue to get information and be able to reach out to us as well. Meredith, any parting words of wisdom for the audience?
I think continuing to sort of, get to know yourself and cultivating your own sort of soft skills really is important. For younger students in particular, informational interviews are a really great way to do that. That's something I assign to a lot of my students. So asking an adult about a possible career path or a possible, work employment situation, like that's a relatively low risk, high help way to get that done. Um, and also getting comfortable with AI in general, I think is going to be important. Making sure, because it is going to be a part of the future. And so understanding it and getting some comfort with what it entails, is really, I think, going to be beneficial for students in the long run.
Absolutely. And I will say, as much as admissions have changed the last few years, the fundamentals have not. You want to have those strong grades to show to the university that you can handle the courses there, and you want to do interesting work that you're passionate about throughout high school, and challenge yourself. So know that no matter what changes with AI, you were still preparing in the right way if you focus on those things. Meredith, thank you so much for joining me tonight, and everyone for listening to us. We really appreciate you carving out time on this chilly day.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was great. It's always fun to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yes.
So,
Okay. Thanks all.
great.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.